Let's talk about the nervous system, the lobes of the brain. There are 4 lobes on each side of the brain. The frontal lobe is where you'll find cognitive functions and decision making. The parietal lobe has to deal with temperature, taste, touch, and movement, and spatial orientation. Occipital lobe has to do with vision. The temporal lobe processes memories. Now let's talk about the brain. The cerebral cortex, or the cerebrum, is the outermost portion of the human brain. It is associated with higher brain functions such as thought and action. So let's start here with the premotor cortex. It is involved in the planning, control, and execution of voluntary movements. The motor cortex is partly responsible for the body's voluntary muscle movements. The primary somatic sensory complex is connected to the thalamus, which coordinates sense of touch and space with muscle movements. The parietal lobe is associated with movement, orientation, recognition, and perception of stimuli. The gustatory area is responsible for perception of taste. Wernicke's area has to do with language comprehension. The primary visual cortex detects visual stimuli. Optic radiation carries visual information to the visual cortex. The cerebellum is associated with the regulation and coordination of movement, posture, and balance. The medulla oblongata maintains vital body functions such as breathing and heart rate. It connects the brain to the spinal column. The pons has to do with motor control and sensory analysis. The primary auditory cortex processes sound information for the brain. The left cerebral hemisphere is associated with logic, and the right cerebral hemisphere is associated with creativity. The prefrontal cortex has to do with problem solving, emotion, and complex thought. And Broca's area is involved with speech production and articulation. This is the central nervous system versus the peripheral nervous system. The central nervous system contains the brain and spinal cord, and the peripheral nervous system is anything outside the brain and spinal cord. There are 12 pair of cranial nerves and 31 pair of spinal nerves. A division of the PNS is the autonomic nervous system. It has to do with the sympathetic and parasympathetic nervous systems. Regulates involuntary muscle movements and glandular actions of the body. Also controls all conscious activities which greatly affect unconscious processes such as heart rate, bowel function, and respiratory rate. Here's a picture of the autonomic versus somatic motor systems. Now, the somatic nervous system, the somatic motor system is part of the peripheral nervous system that handles voluntary control of body movements. So the other part of that would be the sensory portion. Okay, so you can see that these involve movement of muscle. It's voluntary movement of muscle. It is a stimulatory effect. The ACH is acetylcholine. Okay, now in the autonomic nervous system, remember we said there has the parasympathetic and the sympathetic portion. This is part of the peripheral nervous system that acts as an involuntary control system. It controls visceral functions. And you can see that it affects the smooth muscle in the gut, glands, cardiac muscle. Okay? It has a stimulatory or inhibitory effect depending on whether the sympathetic or the parasympathetic system is engaged. Okay? Um, Now, neurons that release acetylcholine are termed cholinergic, and neurons that release norepinephrine are termed adrenergic. In this last slide, we're going to talk about the difference between afferent and efferent neurons. So, this is in the peripheral nervous system. So we have a receptor. Let's say this is a nociceptor, which is a pain receptor. Okay? You prick your finger. So this message goes, this is an afferent transmission through a sensory neuron, goes to the spinal cord, and then the spinal cord sends the message through an efferent transmission down a motor neuron to an effector site, which would be your finger. So you hit it with the pin, and then the motor neuron causes you to take your finger away.